Everybody, please take their position.
Okay.
I would like to keep this space where you stand
We're
free.
going to go ahead and start everything.
Okay, well, there are 4 of us, so I don't know if we don't use that chair. I don't
Yeah, you
know
can use it, but you
whether
have to sit there.
Ah,
No,
okay.
not right here. Okay. So I have a clear.
Let's see if we can open the window a crack. It seems stuffy.
That's a
here.
good idea. Thank you.
If it swings, then maybe we can block it with something, book or
It's
something.
very, no, these windows don't move.
It is going to move?
They won't move.
No?
These windows, no, they're very heavy. They're big too.
This, the book, The Place for Tolerance in Islam has not arrived yet. It has shipped by Amazon, but so we don't lose the weekend. This is a copy of the main essay in the book, which, if you recall, I wrote this essay, and then there were a number of professors that I invited to respond to me from a variety of perspectives. Some in agreement, some very strong disagreement, and then I wrote a response to their responses, basically. And so what you have here is just my main essay, and then when the books arrive, then you can have the rest of the text and read the responses, and it would be, I am, like in the previous classes, I'm interested in this for pedagogical reasons. I'm not interested in the ultimate question of whether Islam is a tolerant religion or not, because frankly I think that's a too simplistic question, and it is it's a question, one of these ethereal questions, like is Sharia consistent with human rights or not? I gave a lecture at the Harvard Divinity School, and I started the question. I started the lecture by saying that the question in the abstract it doesn't mean anything other than simply it's a symbolic construct for a political position, not for an intellectual investigation. And of course, the scholars at the Divinity School appreciated the position very much, because after that I went on to talk about the various doctrinal tensions and tendencies and trends and so on. But very interestingly, the same dynamics we were talking about yesterday, the sort of the pedagogical dynamics, that immediately that phrase was picked up by the Islam bashers or the Islam alarmists, the etc. And it appeared in several books and several websites that, look, here is another proof that Muslims have no interest in human rights. He's saying that it's not human rights, to discover whether human rights and Sharia are consistent is not important. And see, this proves how incompatible they are with our culture, etc., etc. And if my intellectual project as a scholar, and I always encourage, as I said before, you could be an intellectual in the service of scholarship for the sake of scholarship. That's not what I find ethically justifiable. I understand those who argue for it, and like those who argue for science for the sake of science. But to be in the interest of full disclosure, my position is one that argues that there has to be an ethical commitment in scholarship, and an ethical commitment, I would argue, necessarily means an intellectual project, but this is something we, of course, can talk about more, especially as we come to the close of the seminar. But the intellectual project, which is to again, in full disclosure, is to me the idea of the marginalization or the irrelevance of the Islamic either spiritual heritage or intellectual heritage is a tragedy of enormous proportions. I am quite forward about the fact that I believe that the Islamic intellectual and ethical, moral, philosophical heritage has added a great deal to humanity, and that humanity is impoverished by losing it. But I also understand that there is, you could. The past can enrich the present in ways that are purely aesthetic, like a museum piece. You could go and watch the beauty of the Islamic tradition as if you are seeing pieces in a museum, like we see pharaonic remains, remains of Cleopatra and so on and so forth. Some people try to draw ethical principles from the intellectual traditions of the pharaohs, but it's become more and more difficult for a variety of reasons. And I'm not saying that that's insignificant, but to me, I aspire for more than simply having the Islamic tradition being a museum piece. But I fear that between the demagoguery of the two opposite polarized poles that we talked about in previous days, whether the anti-cultural, ahistorical Puritans or the the modern day post-colonialists in reality, we only contribute to what you want to call it globalization. I call it neutralization. It's an increasing process of everything looking the same, tasting the same, being the same, and ultimately a form of human suicide. One of the books that I would, if you haven't read it, would be very interesting to read, is a book by Charles Taylor, The Secular State. It came out recently, and I think it's an intellectual feat, frankly, because Charles Taylor, of course, he's no, he's not a John Finnis, a proponent of the natural law tradition or the Christian heritage, but he is very worried about the effects of modernity and the loss of identity in a global scale and so on. All right, so what part of the historical reality, if you remember the quote that I read yesterday from, what's his name, the smug fellow,
Evolution?
Yeah, the revolution book, right? What was his name again? Christopher Woodbridge or something like that?
With something, yeah.
Yeah.
Smiling Christopher.
Yeah. You know, he says, well, look, there has to be something. If you look all around, the Muslim countries are backwards and retarded and so on, and so there has to be something in the religion. You know, taking this point on dignifies it, I think, too much, because it's rather, frankly, idiotic. But there is a historical reality is that since 1492, do you know why the significance of 1492? That particular date.
That's right after the end of the CFL, right?
Yeah.
Right.
1492,
Reconquista.
the reconquest of Andalusia and the discovery of the New World by Columbus, and the beginning of the what some have called the subaltern phenomena or the nativist phenomena, engaging the natives and exterminating the natives. I mean, so it's very ironic that in the United States, you know, we celebrate Columbus Day, but the tribe, I forgot its name now, but the tribe had a 300,000 members population that welcomed Columbus and Columbus in his diaries. One of the very interesting intellectual experiences is reading Columbus's diaries, because one of the things he says is, you know, he was surprised by how timid these people were towards Christians, and that they came and met Christians with open arms and gave them gifts and so on and so forth. And he talks quite a bit about how the women are naked and they have beautiful bodies, but of course throws in the necessary, you know, oh, this is repulsive or un-Christian, but at the same time acknowledges that this is the beginning of Europe's introduction to syphilis, but what happens is this. Very soon after, within 5 years, that population of 300,000 is exterminated, both by diseases that came from Europe, like typhoid and measles and so on, and also by the very evangelical colonial mentality, which encompassed the whole globe, and the famous papal bull that divided the world into spheres, and you know, so on and so forth. And since 1492, it is fair to say that the West has been taking the world by storm. I mean, it has been a virtual, massive, partly economic, partly developmental, partly informational. It's no longer a wave, it's a storm. And that in one way or the other, the rest of the world is reacting, and reacting in a variety of ways. You know, whether the reaction is the ultimate failed experiment in the Soviet Union of Leninist communism, or the communism that arose in China, but it's also a destruction of traditional culture within the area, or you know, the many case studies. You know, whether the case study of Vietnam or the case study of Cambodia or the case study of Philippines or Indonesia or Malaysia. I mean, the impact on native culture and the ideological reaction to this major paradigm shift has been extremely powerful. Now, I think so far I haven't said anything that controversial, right? We can all agree on this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just making sure, you know. No, part, of course, in the at least the intellectual world that speaks Arabic and or Persian, also Turkish. An argument that I often, you do hear Muslims repeating is that type of simplistic argument of, well, yeah, look, we are everywhere, we are backwards, and this must mean something about our culture and the failure of our cultural values. But I don't think that's actually, in my view, that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is the tracing of there's some in developmental literature. There's it's unfortunate that we lost our development guy, because I'm sure you would be familiar with this literature. But in developmental literature, this is one of the most controversial and debated issues. Is why is it that we find the development of racial units or white culture units. So, for instance, New Zealand or Australia or Iceland, which for a variety of reasons should not have been as developed as they are, but they have developed in remarkable speeds. And interestingly, by the way, some of the racist theories of development started by this inquiry. It's saying, well, look, wherever the white man goes, they bring prosperity. So it must be something. Now, of course, racism then became, after World War II, became increasingly unpopular, and so people started looking for alternative explanations, and we started simplifying a rather very complex field that I don't even claim to fully understand, because who understands the development studies? I studied with David Apter at Yale, one of probably the premier development theorists, but there are so many elements to try to take account of. But we do know that it seems that all types of barriers for the transformation of critical technology and information, and all types of economic barriers, are lowered in response to the perception of a cultural unit. So, for instance, do you understand what that means? Which I explain. Okay, explain. For instance, those who've done some serious micro-level studies have found that the Australian government, firmly in the hands of perceived Europeans and not nativists, had all types of barriers that are usually set up against the exchange of technology, and including financial facilitations or financial incentives are lowered in direct response to the perception that we are dealing with a part of Europe, right? And in one of the very intriguing studies was done on Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico has this rather oblivious state, right? And compared Puerto Rico to Haiti, it's quite remarkable, because Haiti has no obstacles are lowered except for a short period when it was thought to be under the control of the CIA, and then it got some obstacles lowered, but then once it returned to native rule, so to speak, now, and while Puerto Rico is allowed into the club, but with all types of limitations and reservations. Another interesting work that has been done on Alaska, because the geographic resources of Alaska and the way they've been developed has been in direct relation to the fact that it is seen as part of the United States. So, point is that, or actually even a better case of developmental studies is people who focused on South Africa. I mean, some of the best literature on developmental studies is the development policies towards South Africa pre-apartheid, during apartheid and post-apartheid. And some of the, I don't like this category, but what are often called subaltern academics. Subaltern means those who are, suppressed, the systematically, So, the academics of subaltern theory have argued that once South Africa was seen as not being a part of the white club, all types of easements were closed off, and that South Africa has been falling behind developmentally. And this, of course, it's a very serious charge. If you're interested in reading sort of a popularized version of these, it doesn't make any original contribution, but it summarizes a lot of these studies. There's a book written by a Yale law professor called Amy Chua, Chua, who sort of summarizes this whole. Now, of course, this is extremely significant when we even look at cases like Japan or North or South Korea, and what did it take for Japan to be looked as part? Now, Japan was already quite technologically advanced before its defeat, and so part of the challenge with Japan was whether to impoverish it technologically. The American occupation, you discover, particularly if you read in the history of American diplomacy towards Japan, was whether to make sure that Japan is sent back to the medieval ages, or to actually allow Japan to develop on the technological trajectory that it was already on. And in South Korea, now, some have argued, and I guess you can also probably predict this, that a correlation, a statistical correlation, is noticed between the spread of missionary Christianity and the perception of inness. Cultural reservations about South Korea, for instance, the cultural inhibitions were lowered as the number of Christians increased in South Korea, and similarly in Japan. And North Korea becomes increasingly pariah for all types of different reasons, but some people have even said that the Philippines is a better case study, because the Philippines, although Christianizing, but has and gaining major advantages from that, it insisted on a line, an independent line that made it as if it's part of the Christian non-West. In other words, it gained the part of Christianity, but it did not gain admission into the Western club. And then, economists talk about Japan being like an honorary member of the Western club, or South Korea being an honorary member of the Western club, and things such as whether Turkey is on the is sort of this guest who's always standing, always under probation, sort of invited but could be kicked out at any second. And same for Malaysia and Indonesia. And some of actually, this was a while ago, so it's probably outdated a bit now. But about 10 years ago, there was a book about comparing development of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, and especially focusing on Singaporean development, which by all types of logical processes, Singapore should have been as a mess as Gaza. I mean, what does Singapore have? Right? But it's if you've been there, you know that it is actually quite an advancement. So now, to me, this is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning of the conversation. Okay, because quite often, and I think this is the intellectual cop-out. One says, okay, do we blame colonialism or do you blame the natives? Well, if you're talking about blame, I think you've lost the battle from the get-go, because the idea is, well, what can explain phenomena that are before us, and in order to have an intellectual project that is useful, you must have an accurate reading of reality. Otherwise, your intellectual project becomes like, let's all have ijtihad. That will solve everything. What we need is more maslaha, public interest in Sharia. Okay, thank you, goodbye. What we need is more women's rights. Thank you, khalas, let's go home. What have we achieved? Absolutely nothing. We haven't, and this, by the way, continues in the pedagogical problematic of the polarized poles having a monopoly over the discourse, while those who are not leaning towards polarization because they are ultimately not impacting reality and negotiating reality in a meaningful way, they seem to be the passed over majority, if you will. Not even necessarily the silent majority, but the passed over majority. And I want to emphasize this point again, just because it's how often I find it in nature. I mean, I don't know, this might already be an obvious point to you, so forgive me if I'm repeating redundant information, but to say don't blame colonialism, Noah Feldman, you guys have heard of Noah Feldman? Noah Feldman is he's a Harvard law professor. He's one of those people who woke up one day and decided he's an expert in Islamic law, right? But this is all precise, accurate information. He's married. His father is a very established member of the Democratic Party. But he married a woman who is very well connected in the opposite party, the Republican Party. And anyway, when Noah Feldman had just finished law school, he clerked for the Supreme Court, so he's a relatively smart kid, very young, and he starts developing this chummy relationship with some influential Yale law professors, Owen Fiss, Bruce Ackerman, Tony Kronman, who interestingly enough are Democrats. So the father link is there.